everybody. I'm sorry we cannot meet in person today because of everything, all the precautions we're taking for the coronavirus. I'm sorry that school is not meeting. I know some of you probably upset about that, some of you probably are not. But we wanted to send you a little something for our confirmation lesson today. We are here in the very classroom that we would have been in, and these are the people that you would have been with. I'm JT, and
I'm Stanley.
And can we shine to our fancy board? This is what we went over last week for those of you that were here last week, and you can see that I spelled sanctification wrong, and I'm sure y'all remember that. But we talked about all these things, like what was salvation, right? That's what we basically covered in our whole last video, was what did salvation mean, and what did it mean to be walking a life that is a sanctifying life? What does sanctification mean? What is separation and death, and what does that mean in our lives? And we talked about separation and death are these things that have happened since sin has come into the world. When Adam and Eve sinned, there was separation from God, and the ultimate penalty for sin was death. But then we learned that through salvation, through Jesus Christ, that he took care of both of these problems he took care of separation by reconciliation, by bringing us and God back together. And then he also took care of death by resurrecting himself. Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and within Jesus' resurrection, we also celebrate our resurrection from the dead, our resurrection from our sins, our resurrection from our former selves into the people that God is calling us now to be. So that was all last week, and we've talked a lot about what is the Trinity, who is Jesus. We've talked a lot. You haven't been here for a minute. We've been talking. You've covered a lot. We've been talking about a lot of stuff. But this week, who we really wanted to focus on is the founder of the Methodist faith. And so today, who we were going to talk about was John the Man Wesley. John Wesley. And so a lot of things that we do in the Methodist Church are based off of John Wesley's theology. It's based off of the way he kind of viewed the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is a denomination of the Christian church. And he was a very big Anglican, but he wanted to reform the Anglican Church. And the way that he kind of did this was through these methods. And so we like to talk a lot like method. We were called Methodists, but at first it was like a slight
insult.
They were insulting the Methodists. They said, oh, those Methodists, they have a way to everything. But we kind of liked the way it sounded. But we really wanted to talk about how John Wesley kind of got his start into ministry. He was called to be a priest. He was called to be a preacher. And he ended up actually traveling from England, where he was from, over to Savannah, Georgia,
where I'm from.
That's so cool, right?
That's right.
He came to Georgia, and he had this call. His call was he was going to come over and he was going to preach to the Native Americans. Mm-hmm. And this was during like the time of the United States colonies. So this is before the Revolution, when Georgia was still a colony of England. And so John Wesley comes over, but while he's coming over, there's a big storm. Mm-hmm. A big storm that happens, and John Wesley gets really afraid. And while he is on the boat, he's looking around and he sees this group of Moravians. Can you tell us a little bit about what a Moravian is?
Yeah, well, they were a group of people. They had a certain faith. They were not part of the Church of England, but they were on this boat. They were heading to the New World as well. And like JT said, this giant storm comes. The boat is being tossed back and forth. John Wesley is terrified. He's literally hiding in a corner, hunkered down, thinking he is going to die. He's scared to death. And yet these Moravians, they aren't scared. They're standing on the boat. They are praising God, singing songs to God. They have absolutely no fear. And John Wesley feels convicted. He's like, why don't I have faith like that in God? And thankfully, they survived the storm. The storm goes away. But that really shook John Wesley. It really affected him. And he began to doubt at that moment his faith and why he didn't have that confidence that the Moravians had. But they do continue to Georgia.
And he gets to Georgia, and like I said, his call was he was going to preach to the indigenous people, to the Native Americans that were here. Doesn't really go well for John Wesley.
No.
And so he doesn't understand the culture. He just doesn't do well. So he ends up preaching to all of the colonies. He ends up preaching to the people who would come over from England. But even in that, he kind of made some mistakes. He fell in love with a woman, and then she left him to go marry somebody else, and then he refused her communion.
Big no-no.
All these things John Wesley should not be doing. So he actually gets run out of town. They run him back to England. And so it's on all of this, right? There's this great storm. There's him not being able to reach the indigenous people. And then this whole mess of him not refusing communion to this woman. There's all of this failure and doubt that is surrounding John Wesley's life, which is a really interesting thing to think about when we think about the founder of the Methodist tradition, the Methodist faith. Like, he struggled with doubt for a long time. And so he ends up going back to England, still continuing to struggle with this doubt of, do I have faith? Maybe the faith I had isn't as strong as I thought it was.
So he goes to England. He is devastated because he had all these dreams of going to the New World and doing the things that JT talked about, and none of them happened. And he's ran back to England, and due to the things he witnessed on the ship with the Moravians, he's doubting his faith. He's doubting his belief in God. He's doubting whether he's called to still be a minister in the Church of England. And so when he gets home, he starts thinking about that, and he remembers those Moravians on that ship and how they had bravery and faith in the face of almost certain death, in his opinion. And he goes, I need to go learn a little bit from them. So he goes to hang out with a group of Moravians to see if he can learn from them. And while he's there with them, he meets a man named Peter Bowler. Don't really need to remember that name, but it's Peter Bowler is his name. And John Wesley talks to him, tells him about his doubts and all these things. And Peter Bowler has an interesting quote. He says, preach faith until you have it, John. Preach faith until you feel it. He basically said, don't give up. Keep trying, keep preaching. You are definitely called by God. So just keep preaching until you have it. And so John decides, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep going. But he continues to preach in his church, within the Church of England, and it's still not going well. He's still having doubts. He's still having all these doubts about his faith and about his call to ministry, but he keeps going. And the cool thing about John Wesley is he kept a journal his entire life, which we don't really do that nowadays unless you're counting like Facebook or social media. But he kept a journal every day of his life, and we still have those journals today. We can read through them. They've been printed. And during this time we're talking about, when his faith was in doubt, he writes a journal entry, and he says, today I very reluctantly decided to go to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street. He didn't want to go. He wasn't feeling it. He didn't think he'd get anything out of it. He didn't want to go to this Bible study at Aldersgate. But he decides to go anyway, and he says in his journal, while the scripture was being read that night, my heart was strangely warmed. And you see, John Wesley, he had a great knowledge of God up here. He had been to the best schools of theology. He had read all the books he could get his hand on. He knew God up here. But it's at that moment at Aldersgate that he begins to feel God in his heart. And at that moment, his life is entirely changed. He leaves that place and he goes back to his church and he begins to preach about God just the way he had always done. But he begins to add to that, and he begins to preach with passion and intensity. And people for the first time actually start to listen to him. And he's super excited, but the Church of England doesn't like it. They don't like some of the new things he's saying. They don't like that he's preaching with feeling and emotion. They want you to preach just with your intellect. And so they say, John, you can't do that. He goes, this is who I am. This is how I'm going to preach now. He keeps going, and they say, fine, if you continue to preach like that, you can't preach in our churches. You think that stopped him, JT?
No way.
It did not
No
stop
way.
him. He said, I'm not stopping. So he said, if you won't let me preach in the building, I'll go into the fields. He begins to go into the fields and into the street and invite anyone who's around to come and listen to him talk about God. And so a lot of people show up to hear Wesley talk that never would have stepped foot in the Church of England. They come to see him and to hear him preach, and they begin to believe in God. And as they do so, John Wesley starts putting them in these groups and these classes, these small groups basically, to help them continue to grow and to learn about God. And they practice these methods that we talked about, that he'd been doing his whole life. And that's really the basis, the beginning of what would hundreds of years down the road, become the church that we have today. John Wesley didn't start the Methodist Church at that time. Like JT said, it was a reform movement within the Anglican Church. And I think there's a lesson later on down the line that's going to talk about how you get from there to where we are today. But that's really what we wanted to tell you about John Wesley today.
So, hopefully we'll be able to meet again soon. We were already going to take next week off for spring break and stuff like that, but hopefully we'll be able to meet again soon. But if not, we'll continue to kind of make this little video series and we'll see how it goes. So we hope everyone is being safe out there. We hope everyone is practicing social distancing.
Correct. That's the new word.
Social distancing is the thing right now. So we hope everybody's being safe, and we hope you learn a lot. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to let me know. My email address is youthdirector@bpumc.org, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about anything like this. So I think that's all we have.
That's it
for today. So see y'all later.